The cabin gasped as the lights cut out and the plane dropped fast. An engine had failed. Then the second sputtered. In the chaos, a flight attendant pointed down the aisle and yelled, "Her, row 17, now same." A man scoffed. "What, her? She probably thinks the cockpit's a TikTok set." But the girl in row 17 stood without a word and walked toward the controls like she'd done it before. "If you believe calm hands don't need loud voices," type row 17 ready below. Claire Avery, 26 years old, occupied window seat 17A in complete anonymity, her presence as unremarkable as her deliberately casual appearance. High-quality noise-canceling headphones covered her ears while she maintained the half-closed eyes of someone either sleeping or deeply absorbed in meditation. To her fellow passengers, she appeared to be just another young traveler, possibly a graduate student or social media influencer, who preferred quiet observation to constant digital engagement. Her wardrobe reinforced the impression of studied normalcy, an oversized university sweatshirt that concealed her athletic build, well-worn running shoes that suggested regular exercise, but nothing specialized, and complete absence of makeup or jewelry that might draw unwanted attention. No smartphone remained constantly visible in her hands like most passengers her age. She simply existed in peaceful solitude. United Flight 847 had departed Denver International Airport precisely on schedule, bound for Raleigh-Durham, with weather conditions optimal for the 3-hour journey. The Boeing 737-800 carried 137 passengers and 6 crew members through routine flight operations that should have concluded without incident. Everything remained normal for exactly 52 minutes after takeoff. The first indication of trouble came as a sharp metallic pop that reverberated through the aircraft's structure, a sound that experienced travelers might dismiss as thermal expansion or normal mechanical settling, but which immediately caught Claire's trained attention. A subtle vibration began transmitting through the cabin floor, creating an almost imperceptible tremor that most passengers wouldn't notice, but which triggered every instinct Claire had developed during years of military aviation training. Then the starboard engine failed completely. Cabin lights flickered ominously before several sections went completely dark. Passengers throughout the aircraft released collective gasps of fear and confusion as the plane's smooth flight characteristics suddenly changed to an alarming downward trajectory. The port engine began producing irregular sounds, sputtering and losing power in a pattern that Claire recognized as imminent total failure. The aircraft dropped altitude rapidly, triggering automatic deployment of oxygen masks throughout the passenger compartment. Emergency lighting activated along the aisles while a child's terrified screaming pierced through the general atmosphere of rising panic. From the cockpit, a barely controlled voice transmitted through the intercom system. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are currently experiencing complete systems failure. Please remain seated with seatbelts secured while we assess our options." The lead flight attendant, Sandra Martinez, unbuckled from her jump seat and began moving urgently down the center aisle, not toward the cockpit, but directly toward row 17, her destination clearly predetermined by some internal protocol that other passengers couldn't understand. "You," Martinez shouted, pointing directly at Claire with obvious urgency. "Ma'am, in the window seat, we need you in the cockpit immediately." Every passenger within hearing distance turned to stare at the quiet young woman who had spent the entire flight in unremarkable anonymity. A businessman across the aisle voiced what many others were thinking. "What, her? She probably thinks the cockpit is just another TikTok recording studio." Another passenger added his own skeptical assessment. "They're seriously sending some college kid up front to help with this emergency." But Claire's reaction defied every assumption being made about her capabilities and background. She didn't display panic confusion or the desperate eagerness of someone trying to help beyond their qualifications. Instead, she calmly removed her headphones, folded them with practiced efficiency, and stood with the measured composure of someone accessing familiar muscle memory rather than responding to unprecedented crisis. She handed her small carry-on bag to the passenger beside her, nodded acknowledgement to the flight attendant, and began walking toward the cockpit with the steady gait of someone who belonged exactly where she was going. The cockpit presented a scene of barely controlled chaos that would have overwhelmed most civilian passengers. First Officer Williams had lost consciousness due to oxygen deprivation after secondary electrical systems had shorted out, cutting power to essential life support equipment. Captain Rodriguez remained semi-conscious, his hands gripping the control yoke with desperate determination, but clearly fighting the effects of hypoxia and system overload. Claire entered the cramped flight deck with the confident familiarity of someone who had spent countless hours in similar high-stress environments. Without hesitation, she reached across the instrument panel and deactivated the emergency autopilot override that had been fighting against manual control inputs, immediately stabilizing the aircraft's erratic flight path. Her movements were precise and efficient as she began systematically checking instrument redundancy pathways and backup system configurations. "Ma'am, who exactly are you?" Sandra Martinez asked breathlessly, her voice carrying a mixture of hope and bewilderment at this unexpected development. "Claire Avery," she responded with matter-of-fact calm while her hands continued working through emergency checklist procedures. "Former Air National Guard 139th Airlift Wing, C-130 flight instructor specializing in emergency operations. 4 years of intensive nighttime crisis management training. Current civilian pilot certification with multi-engine commercial endorsement." The flight attendant's eyes widened with sudden understanding and relief. "You're actually a qualified pilot. At 30,000 feet with total engine failure, I'm the most qualified pilot you're going to find," Claire replied, her attention never wavering from the critical task of aircraft systems assessment. Back in the passenger cabin, confused murmurs were transforming into focused attention as word spread about the young woman who had seemed so ordinary just minutes earlier. A middle-aged executive who had witnessed Claire's purposeful walk to the cockpit turned to his seatmate. "Is she really taking control of this aircraft?" Claire was already implementing emergency procedures with systematic precision. She restored hydraulic pressure to critical flight control surfaces, established supplemental oxygen flow to the captain's position, and engaged manual trim control systems that would allow her to maintain stable flight without functional engines. Using her knowledge of regional geography and prevailing wind patterns, she calculated an optimal emergency glide slope that would carry them eastward towards suitable landing facilities while maximizing their altitude retention and distance coverage. "She's actually stabilizing our flight path," Sandra whispered to another crew member, her voice filled with amazement. "The aircraft is responding to her control inputs." Throughout the passenger compartment, the crew jokes and dismissive comments had completely disappeared, replaced by respectful silence, as people began to understand that their survival depended on the competence of someone they had severely underestimated. Claire's hands moved across the instrument panel with the fluid efficiency that comes only from extensive training and real-world experience under pressure. She compensated for the loss of engine power by optimizing the aircraft's aerodynamic configuration, adjusting wing flaps and control surfaces to achieve maximum glide performance. Her voice remained steady as she communicated with the semi-conscious captain. "Captain Rodriguez, I need you to stay with me. We're going to execute a dead-stick landing, but I need your help with the checklist verification." The transformation in cabin atmosphere was remarkable. Passengers who had been on the verge of panic just minutes earlier now watched the cockpit area with quiet confidence, understanding that their emergency was being handled by someone whose qualifications extended far beyond anything they could have imagined. Claire's presence had shifted the entire dynamic of the crisis from desperate chaos to controlled emergency management, proving that competence often exists in the most unexpected places, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself when circumstances demand exceptional skill and unshakable composure. If you've ever witnessed silence become the most powerful force in a crisis situation, share this story with someone who has underestimated the quiet professionals around them. Air traffic control at Greensboro High Point Airport had already initiated full emergency protocols after losing radio contact with Flight 847's original crew. Emergency vehicles were positioning themselves along potential approach vectors, while controllers attempted to establish a communication with whoever might be managing the aircraft's emergency situation. The facility's operations center buzzed with controlled urgency as senior controllers tried to understand the scope of the crisis they were managing. "Flight 847, this is Greensboro Tower. We have lost contact with your flight crew. Please identify the person currently operating the aircraft and provide status update on your emergency situation." Claire reached for the radio microphone with steady hands, her voice cutting through the static with professional clarity that immediately commanded attention throughout the control facility. "Greensboro Tower, this is Claire Avery assuming pilot and command responsibilities for Flight 847 due to crew incapacitation, aircraft experiencing complete dual-engine failure with partial systems functionality remaining, requesting emergency vectors and priority clearance for dead-stick approach into Greensboro High Point Airport. The primary controller froze at his station, his hand hovering over his response controls as he processed the implications of what he had just heard. Flight 847, did you say Claire Avery? Please confirm pilot identification and qualifications. Before Claire could respond, a different voice broke into the emergency frequency with unmistakable authority. Greensboro Tower, this is Commander Michael Blaine, 139th Airlift Wing Operations. Claire Avery is confirmed qualified for emergency command authority. Provide her with full cooperation and any assistance she requires. She has my complete authorization. At the control tower fell into momentary silence as controllers processed this unprecedented intervention from Military Aviation Command. Then came the response that would clear the way for what followed. Flight 847, you are cleared for unrestricted emergency approach. You have absolute priority for all airspace and runway access. Fire crash crews are standing by. Claire's hands remained remarkably steady as she began the complex process of configuring the powerless aircraft for what would essentially be a controlled crash landing. She manually adjusted flap settings to optimize lift-to-drag ratios, coordinated airspeed management using only gravitational energy, and calculated approach angles using backup altimeter readings and visual reference points. As the Greensboro High Point runway complex became visible through the cockpit windscreen, she turned toward Captain Rodriguez, who was struggling to maintain consciousness but following her emergency procedures with professional recognition of her competence. Captain, we're bringing everyone home safely today. I need you to focus on breathing normally and trust that we're going to execute a textbook emergency landing. The aircraft's descent was masterfully controlled despite the complete absence of engine power. Claire used every principle of aerodynamics and energy management she had learned during years of military training, treating the powerless Boeing 737 like a massive glider that could be coaxed into a safe landing through precise manipulation of available control surfaces. The runway approached at exactly the optimal angle and airspeed that she had calculated for their aircraft weight and atmospheric conditions. Main landing gear contacted the runway surface at precisely 124 knots, dead center of the runway centerline, with minimal vertical impact force that protected both aircraft structure and passenger safety. The aircraft rolled to a complete stop using only aerodynamic braking and mechanical wheel friction, coming to rest approximately 2/3 down the runway length. Not a single passenger or crew member sustained injuries beyond minor stress-related symptoms. The moment the aircraft's engines stopped and cabin doors were opened by ground crews, the tarmac filled with emergency responders, medical personnel, Federal Aviation Administration investigators, and media representatives who had monitored the emergency radio traffic. But remarkably, no one approached Claire requesting identification verification or credentials documentation. Every aviation professional present from air traffic controllers to emergency response coordinators simply nodded with the respect accorded to someone whose performance had spoken louder than any documentation could have provided. Her emergency landing would be studied in aviation training programs as a textbook example of skill under pressure. National news outlets covered the incident extensively, though their reporting focused primarily on the dramatic nature of the emergency rather than the specific qualifications of the person who had prevented what could have been a catastrophic loss of life. Unidentified woman successfully lands commercial airliner after complete engine failure became the standard headline across major networks and aviation publications worldwide. Television footage showed blurry images of Claire stepping down the aircraft stairs, hood pulled up over her head, eyes focused straight ahead, moving with the same unremarkable composure she had maintained throughout the crisis. To casual observers, she appeared to be just another passenger, grateful to have survived a frightening experience. But within military aviation communities and professional pilot networks, her name began circulating with the kind of respect reserved for individuals whose competence had been demonstrated under the most demanding circumstances possible. Comments appeared on restricted aviation forums, accessible only to certified military and commercial pilots. Claire Avery used to train our emergency descent instructors at the 139th. Her simulation performance records were legendary. Her service record was impeccable. So impeccable that most people never heard about her because she never needed remedial training or special recognition. She didn't leave military service because of dissatisfaction. She just stopped needing to announce herself to prove her capabilities. Dead stick landing a 737 with passengers aboard, that's something most of us practice in simulators, but pray we never have to execute in reality. 1 week after the emergency landing, Claire discovered an envelope that had been delivered to her apartment address not through normal postal service, but hand-delivered by someone with access to her personal information through military channels. The correspondence wasn't from United Airlines Federal Aviation Administration investigators or media representatives seeking interviews about her heroic actions. Instead, it contained a brief handwritten note on official military letterhead: Claire, some pilots fly with official clearance and regulatory authorization. You fly with something more valuable, absolute certainty, and unshakable competence under pressure. You're cleared for any airspace, anytime, any conditions. Respectfully, Commander Michael Blaine, 39th Airlift Wing. Claire didn't post about the flight on social media platforms or seek recognition for her actions during the emergency. She didn't grant interviews to aviation magazines or participate in the media attention that continued for weeks following the incident. She simply returned to her normal routine and quiet life, confident that her actions had spoken more effectively than any amount of publicity or self-promotion could have achieved. However, she did notice an interesting change in her subsequent commercial flight experiences. Every time she booked airline tickets for personal or professional travel, row 17 mysteriously remained available, never assigned to other passengers, never blocked for operational reasons, never unavailable due to overbooking or aircraft configuration changes. The seat remained open quietly without explanation or fanfare. Flight crews seemed to recognize her name during check-in procedures, though they never made any direct comments about her background or the emergency landing that had made her legendary within aviation circles. Gate agents would ensure she had priority boarding privileges without being asked. Air traffic controllers at various airports began recognizing her voice during private pilot communications, though they maintained professional protocols while providing her with expedited clearances and preferred routing. The aviation community had quietly acknowledged that some people earn their place in the sky through demonstrated competence rather than bureaucratic credentials, and that the most valuable qualifications are those proven under pressure when lives depend on performance rather than paperwork. For more stories where calm hands rewrite emergency protocols and quiet competence saves the day, subscribe to Steelheart Stories.